Welcome to Slumbertainment. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let yourself relax. Tonight we explore the history of projectiles. Please like and subscribe for more restful content. Now let's begin. The story of projectiles begins not with invention, but with a fundamental shift in human thinking. For millions of years, our ancestors lived within arm's reach of their world. To gather food, they needed to be close enough to grasp it. To defend themselves, they required proximity to threat. But somewhere in the depths of prehistory, perhaps 3 million years ago, early hominids discovered they could extend their reach beyond the limits of their own bodies. They learned to throw. The act of throwing itself represents a remarkable evolutionary adaptation. Humans possess a unique shoulder structure, quite different from our closest primate relatives. The configuration of our rotator cuff, the mobility of our scapula, and the ability to store elastic energy in our shoulder tendons allows us to hurl objects with extraordinary speed and accuracy. A chimpanzee can throw certainly, but not with the velocity or precision of a human. This anatomical gift would shape the entire trajectory of human technological development. The earliest projectiles were simply objects found in nature. Rocks represented the most obvious choice. A stone that fit comfortably in the hand could be hurled at prey or predators, extending the reach of human agency across distances that would have seemed magical to earlier species. Archaeological sites from the Paleolithic era reveal countless stones that show evidence of having been thrown, their surfaces bearing the distinctive impact marks of violent collision. These were not tools in the traditional sense. They were disposable, one-use extensions of human will. But throwing rocks presented obvious limitations. Accuracy decreased dramatically with distance. The energy required to throw effectively exhausted the thrower quickly. And perhaps most significantly, suitable throwing stones were not always available when needed. These constraints drove innovation. Early humans began to shape stones specifically for throwing, creating spherical or ovoid forms that flew more predictably through the air. They learned that certain shapes cut through wind resistance more efficiently than others, an intuitive understanding of aerodynamics that predated any formal physics by hundreds of thousands of years. The spear emerged as humanity's first purpose-built projectile weapon, though its origins remain shrouded in the mists of deep time. The earliest conclusive evidence of spear technology dates to approximately 400,000 years ago, from the Schöningen site in present-day Germany. Here, archaeologists discovered 8 wooden spears, carefully crafted from spruce trunks, their points hardened by fire. These were not crude sharpened sticks. They were sophisticated instruments, each measuring between 6 and 8 feet in length, with their center of mass positioned toward the front third of the shaft for optimal flight characteristics. The craftsmen who shaped these weapons understood weight distribution and balance in ways that would not be formally articulated until the development of classical mechanics. The spear represented a quantum leap in projectile technology. Unlike a thrown rock, a spear could be retrieved and reused. Its elongated form provided superior penetration, concentrating force along a narrow point, and perhaps most importantly, a spear transformed the relationship between hunter and hunted. A human armed with a spear could bring down prey many times their own size, could defend against predators from a safe distance, could compete effectively in an ecological landscape dominated by creatures with far greater physical strength. Yet throwing a spear by hand still imposed limits. The human arm, for all its evolutionary optimization, could only impart so much energy to a projectile. This fundamental constraint led to one of the most important inventions in human history, the atlatl, known in some regions as a spear thrower, or woomera. This device first appeared approximately 30,000 years ago, though some evidence suggests even earlier origins. The principle was elegant in its simplicity. A rigid shaft, typically measuring between 1 and 2 feet in length, featured a hook or socket at one end and a grip at the other. By holding the atlatl and using it to extend the effective length of the throwing arm, a user could dramatically increase the leverage applied to a spear, more than doubling its velocity upon release. The physics of the atlatl are straightforward but profound. By increasing the radius of the throwing arc, the device allowed the same muscular effort to accelerate a projectile over a greater distance, resulting in substantially higher exit velocity. A spear thrown by hand might reach speeds of 60 to 70 miles per hour. The same spear, launched via atlatl, could exceed 100 miles per hour. This translated directly into increased range and penetrating power. Moreover, the atlatl improved accuracy by providing a more consistent release point and reducing the variables introduced by direct hand contact with the spear shaft. Archaeological evidence reveals that atlatl technology spread independently across multiple continents. Indigenous peoples of Australia developed sophisticated versions. Native Americans throughout both continents employed them extensively. In ancient Mexico, the Aztecs considered the atlatl a weapon of both practical and ceremonial significance. This convergent evolution suggests that the advantages of the spear thrower were so obvious, so immediately beneficial, that different cultures separated by vast distances and millennia arrived at virtually identical solutions to the same fundamental problem: how to make a projectile travel farther and strike harder. The sling represents another ancient innovation, perhaps even older than the atlatl, though its precise origins are difficult to establish because organic materials decay. A sling consists of little more than a pouch connected to two cords. Yet this simple configuration transforms a stone into a formidable projectile. The user places a stone in the pouch, holds both cords, whirls the assembly overhead to build rotational velocity, then releases one cord at the optimal moment. The stone departs at tremendous speed, far exceeding what could be achieved by throwing alone. Skilled slingers could achieve remarkable results. Historical accounts describe ancient Greek and Roman slingers striking targets at ranges exceeding 600 feet. The projectiles, often specially shaped stones or lead bullets cast specifically for use in slings, could penetrate armor and inflict devastating injuries. The kinetic energy delivered by a sling stone rivaled that of early firearms. Like the atlatl, the sling appeared independently in cultures worldwide, from the shepherds of the Mediterranean to the warriors of the Andes, each tradition developing its own techniques and tactical applications. These early projectile technologies shared common threads. Each represented an attempt to overcome the fundamental limitations of human physiology, to strike at distances greater than arm's length, to deliver force beyond what muscle alone could generate. They embodied an understanding, perhaps unconscious but nonetheless sophisticated, of mechanical advantage, of trajectory, of the relationship between mass, velocity, and impact. In crafting these weapons, early humans were conducting experiments in applied physics, testing hypotheses about how objects move through space, refining their designs through countless iterations across thousands of generations. The projectile separated cause from effect in a way that transformed human capability. A thrown stone travels from hand to target in less than a second, yet in that brief interval, human agency extends across space in a manner no other creature could replicate. This extension of reach, this ability to affect the world at a distance, would become one of the defining characteristics of human technology, a thread that runs unbroken from the first thrown rock to the guided missiles of the modern age. The bow and arrow represents one of humanity's most consequential inventions. a technology so transformative that its appearance marks a distinct boundary in the archaeological record. Unlike the gradual evolution of thrown weapons, the bow emerged as a complete system, requiring the integration of multiple components and an understanding of principles that would not be formally described until the development of materials science and elastic mechanics thousands of years later. The earliest definitive evidence of bow technology dates to approximately 10,000 years ago, though tantalizing hints suggest the possibility of earlier origins. The challenge in establishing precise dates stems from the perishable nature of the materials involved. Wood, sinew, and plant fibers decay rapidly in most environments, leaving behind only indirect traces. Arrowheads without their shafts, wear patterns on stone tools used to shape bow components, depictions in cave art that suggest but do not prove the presence of archery technology. What makes the bow remarkable is not merely its effectiveness as a weapon, but the sophistication required to create one. A functional bow demands an understanding of wood properties that varies by species and even by the part of the tree from which the wood is harvested. The outer layers of many tree species, the sapwood, possess different elastic characteristics than the inner heartwood. Ancient bowyers learned to exploit these differences, crafting bows where tension and compression forces distributed themselves optimally across the limb structure. The physics of a bow involve the storage and release of elastic potential energy. When an archer draws the string, they bend the bow's limbs, storing energy in the deformed wood. The limbs want to return to their original straight configuration, and when released, they convert that stored energy into kinetic energy, accelerating the arrow. The efficiency of this energy transfer depends on numerous factors: the bow's draw weight, the smoothness of the draw curve, the mass of the arrow relative to the energy available, and the speed at which the limbs can return to their resting position. Different cultures develop distinct bow designs optimized for their specific needs and available materials. The English longbow, which would achieve legendary status in medieval warfare, represented one approach: a simple self-bow, meaning constructed from a single piece of wood, typically yew. These bows measured 6 feet or more in length and required tremendous strength to draw, with draw weights often exceeding 100 pounds. In skilled hands, a longbow could send an arrow over 300 yards and penetrate armour at closer ranges. In contrast, the composite bow emerged from the steppes of Central Asia, engineered for use on horseback. These bows employed multiple materials bonded together in layers: wood for the core, horn on the belly to resist compression, and sinew on the back to handle tension. This composite construction allowed for much shorter bows that nonetheless achieved power comparable to or exceeding the longbow. The recurve design, where the tips of the unstrung bow curved away from the archer, provided additional mechanical advantage. When strung, these curves flattened, storing extra energy that contributed to arrow velocity. The manufacture of a composite bow required extraordinary skill and patience. The materials had to be carefully prepared, shaped, and bonded using animal glues. The assembly process often took a year or more, with periods of drying between each stage. The resulting weapon, however, could last for decades and represented a significant investment in both labour and materials. Mongol warriors carried composite bows that could accurately strike targets at 200 yards while riding at full gallop, a combination of weapons technology and horsemanship that gave them tactical superiority across vast territories. The arrow itself deserves recognition as a sophisticated projectile, despite its apparent simplicity. An effective arrow requires precise balance between several competing factors. The shaft must be straight and uniform in diameter, typically constructed from wood species that combine lightweight with adequate stiffness. The fletching, usually made from feathers, provides aerodynamic stability through a principle later formalized as drag stabilization. As the arrow flies, any deviation from straight flight causes the fletching to create unequal air resistance, generating a correcting force that returns the arrow to its proper trajectory. The phenomenon of Archer's paradox presented a puzzle that ancient fletchers solved through empirical observation long before anyone could explain the underlying physics. When an archer releases an arrow, the string does not push directly in line with the arrow shaft, but rather from the side. This off-center force should, in theory, send the arrow flying wildly off course. Instead, the arrow flexes around the bow as it accelerates, bending like a snake moving around an obstacle. The stiffness of the arrow shaft, known as its spine, must match the draw weight of the bow and the mass of the arrowhead for this flexing to occur properly. Too stiff or too flexible, and the arrow will indeed fly erratically. Ancient arrow makers discovered through trial and error the precise combinations that worked, adjusting variables they could observe even without understanding the complex dynamics at play. Arrowheads evolved into dozens of specialized forms, each optimized for specific purposes. Broad hunting heads with wide cutting surfaces maximize tissue damage and blood loss. Narrow bodkin points concentrated force on a small area to pierce armor. Some designs featured barbs that made extraction difficult and painful. Others employed reverse barbs or tangs that allowed the head to detach from the shaft when embedded, ensuring that attempts to remove the arrow would likely leave the metal point lodged in the wound. This diversity reflects not just technological capability, but strategic thinking about the varied contexts in which projectiles might be employed. The crossbow appeared in China by the 5th century before the Common Era, representing a radical reimagining of bow technology. Rather than storing energy in the archer's muscles during the aiming process, the crossbow employed a mechanical trigger to hold the string at full draw. This separation of power and aim transformed archery from a skill requiring years of training into something an ordinary soldier could learn in hours. The trade-off involved rate of fire. A skilled longbowman might loose 10 or 12 arrows per minute, while a crossbowman might manage only 2 or 3 bolts in the same period. The crossbow's mechanical advantage came from its stock and trigger mechanism, which allowed for draw weights far exceeding what any human could hold manually. Some military crossbows required mechanical aids like windlasses or cranks to draw the string, their power measured in hundreds of pounds of draw weight. The bolts, shorter and heavier than arrows, flew with flatter trajectories and tremendous kinetic energy at close to medium range. In medieval Europe, the crossbow was considered so devastating that Pope Innocent II attempted to ban its use against Christians in 1139, though this prohibition was widely ignored. The development of projectile weapons followed a pattern that would repeat throughout history: the quest for greater range, increased accuracy, improved penetration, and ease of use. Each innovation addressed one or more of these factors, though often at the expense of others. The atlatl increased range and power, but remained difficult to master. The bow offered superior accuracy and rate of fire, but required extensive training. The crossbow democratized access to powerful projectile weapons, but sacrificed shooting speed. By the medieval period, archers and crossbowmen understood intuitively what modern ballisticians would later express mathematically: that a projectile's trajectory follows a parabolic arc, that wind deflects lighter projectiles more than heavier ones, that kinetic energy decreases with distance due to air resistance. They knew that elevation increased range, that consistency and release technique improved accuracy, that arrow weight affected both velocity and penetration. This knowledge, accumulated through generations of practice and experimentation, represented a form of practical physics, empirical understanding divorced from theoretical framework but no less valid for its application. The age of muscle-powered projectiles reached its zenith in the medieval era. Armies of archers could darken the sky with volleys of arrows, raining death on formations hundreds of yards distant. Crossbowmen could penetrate the finest armor. Engineers designed increasingly sophisticated siege weapons, mechanical artillery that hurled stones and incendiaries across castle walls. Yet even as these technologies reached their highest development, a new force was emerging that would transform projectile warfare beyond recognition: gunpowder. The medieval period witnessed an arms race between defensive fortifications and the siege weapons designed to overcome them. Stone walls grew thicker and taller, towers multiplied, and moats deepened. In response, military engineers developed increasingly sophisticated machines for hurling projectiles with enough force to crack masonry and terrorize defenders. These engines of war represented the culmination of mechanical projectile technology, the highest achievement of leverage, torsion, and counterweight before the age of gunpowder transformed the nature of siege warfare entirely. The catapult family encompasses several distinct designs, each exploiting different mechanical principles to store and release energy. The earliest forms appeared in ancient Greece, but medieval engineers refined and expanded these concepts into weapons of remarkable power and precision. Understanding the distinctions between these machines requires examining the specific mechanisms by which each stored potential energy and converted it into projectile motion. Torsion catapults, which included the ballista and the mangonel, derived their power from twisted rope or sinew bundles. The principle relied on the elastic properties of fibrous materials when wound tightly under tension. Horizontal beams inserted into these rope bundles could be winched backward against tremendous resistance. When released, the bundles unwound violently, driving the beams forward and launching projectiles. The ballista resembled an oversized crossbow, firing large bolts or stones along a relatively flat trajectory with considerable accuracy. Some ballistas could strike targets at ranges exceeding 400 yards, their projectiles capable of penetrating multiple ranks of soldiers or punching through wooden fortifications. The mangonel employed a single throwing arm inserted into a torsion bundle. Crews winched the arm downward, storing energy in the twisted ropes, then released it to swing upward and forward. At the arm's end, a sling or cup held the projectile, which departed at the apex of the swing. Mangonels hurled stones weighing 50 to 100 pounds over castle walls, the projectiles arcing high before descending onto buildings, siege engines, or massed defenders. The weapon's chief limitation involved the wear on torsion bundles, which degraded rapidly with use and required frequent replacement or retentioning. The trebuchet represented the pinnacle of medieval siege artillery, a machine so effective that it rendered many earlier designs obsolete and influenced castle architecture throughout Europe and the Middle East. Unlike torsion devices, the trebuchet employed gravity as its power source, using a massive counterweight to swing a long beam and accelerate a projectile to remarkable velocities. The elegance of the design lay in its mechanical efficiency and scalability. A typical trebuchet featured a beam perhaps 30 to 50 feet long, pivoting on an axle mounted atop a sturdy frame. The short end of the beam carried a counterweight, often a box filled with stones or earth weighing several tons. The long end terminated in a sling that held the projectile. To prepare the weapon, crews used winches to pull the long arm downward, raising the counterweight. When released, gravity pulled the counterweight down, whipping the long arm upward and forward. The sling remained attached at one end, while the other end featured a release mechanism, typically a hook or ring that slipped free at the optimal moment in the throwing arc, sending the projectile flying toward its target. The physics governing trebuchet performance involved the conversion of gravitational potential energy into rotational kinetic energy, and finally into the linear kinetic energy of the projectile. The ratio between the counterweight mass and projectile mass determined the velocity achieved, while the length ratio between the counterweight arm and throwing arm affected the mechanical advantage. Medieval engineers experimented extensively with these ratios, discovering through trial and observation the relationships that modern physics would later express through equations governing torque, angular momentum, and energy conservation. Large trebuchets could hurl stones weighing 300 pounds or more over distances exceeding 300 yards. The impact of such projectiles devastated stone walls, the concentrated kinetic energy fracturing masonry and creating breaches through which assault forces could pour. Contemporary accounts describe the psychological effect of trebuchet bombardment as nearly equal to its physical destructiveness. Defenders watched massive stones arc through the sky, powerless to prevent their descent, knowing each impact might collapse a tower or crush dozens of soldiers. Medieval siege engineers also weaponized disease and terror through creative ammunition choices. Trebuchets launched dead animals into besieged cities, hoping to spread pestilence among defenders. Some accounts describe the hurling of severed heads, prisoners, or even live captives, though the accuracy of such claims remains debatable. Incendiary projectiles wrapped in pitch-soaked cloth could start fires behind walls, while large pottery vessels filled with quicklime created choking clouds when they shattered. The counterweight trebuchet appeared in the Mediterranean world around the 12th century, possibly originating in the Byzantine Empire or among its Islamic engineers, though its precise genesis remains uncertain. The design spread rapidly across Europe, displacing earlier torsion machines. Construction of a large trebuchet required significant resources and skilled labour, but the weapon could function reliably for extended periods with minimal maintenance, unlike torsion devices whose rope bundles deteriorated quickly. Accuracy in trebuchet operation depended on consistency in every aspect of the launch sequence. The counterweight had to be exactly the same mass for each shot. The projectile weight needed careful measurement. The sling release had to occur at precisely the correct point in the arc. Wind conditions affected trajectory, as did temperature and humidity, which altered air density. Experienced crews learned to compensate for these variables, adjusting aim through subtle changes in release timing or counterweight mass. The best teams could place consecutive shots within a few yards of each other at ranges exceeding 200 yards, an impressive feat given the scale and complexity of the machinery involved. Smaller siege engines served specialised roles. The spring-ailed, similar to a large crossbow mounted on a frame, fired oversized bolts capable of skewering multiple soldiers. These weapons provided suppressive fire during assaults, targeting defenders on walls or destroying siege equipment. The accuracy of spring-aileds exceeded that of stone-throwing engines, making them valuable for eliminating specific threats, like enemy artillery crews or commanders directing the defence. The development of siege artillery drove corresponding innovations in defensive architecture. Castle walls grew thicker at their bases, sometimes 20 feet or more, to absorb the impact of heavy projectiles. Engineers designed walls with a pronounced batter, an outward slope at the base that deflected descending stones. Towers became rounded rather than square, as curved surfaces distributed impact forces more effectively and eliminated corners vulnerable to concentrated bombardment. The interplay between offensive and defensive technology created an evolutionary pressure that shaped medieval military architecture. By the 14th century, siege engineers had optimized mechanical artillery to a degree that left little room for further improvement. Trebuchets had grown as large as practical construction methods allowed. Torsion devices had reached the limits imposed by available materials. The theoretical maximum performance of gravity-powered machines had been approached through centuries of refinement. Yet even as these weapons achieved their mature form, a new technology was emerging that would render them obsolete within a few generations. The age of gunpowder was beginning, and with it would come projectiles that derived their energy not from mechanical advantage or gravity, but from the violent expansion of burning gases confined within metal tubes. The transition from medieval siege warfare to early modern conflict was not abrupt but gradual, a period during which mechanical and chemical propulsion coexisted on battlefields across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. This era witnessed the final refinement of muscle-powered projectile weapons alongside the awkward adolescence of gunpowder artillery. Understanding this transitional period requires examining both the technological limitations that constrained early firearms and the tactical innovations that eventually established their dominance despite those limitations. Archers and crossbowmen remained militarily relevant well into the 16th century, even as cannons grew larger and handguns more common. The reasons were practical rather than sentimental. A skilled archer could loose 10 arrows per minute with reasonable accuracy at ranges exceeding 200 yards. An early musketeer might fire 2 shots per minute, perhaps 3 if rushing, and could barely hit a man-sized target beyond 50 yards. Rain rendered matchlock mechanisms unreliable, while damp powder refused to ignite. Arrows continued to fly regardless of weather. The infrastructure required to support firearms, including powder mills, shot foundries, and specialized gunsmiths, was expensive and complex compared to the relatively simple supply chains serving archers. Yet firearms possessed advantages that ultimately proved decisive. Gunpowder weapons penetrated armor more effectively than arrows, even relatively weak early guns. The psychological impact of firearms exceeded their actual lethality. The flash, smoke, and thunderous report terrified horses and unsettled troops in ways that silent arrows did not. Most importantly, firearms democratized violence. Training a longbowman required beginning in childhood, developing the unusual musculature and technique over years of practice. A peasant could learn to operate a musket in weeks, becoming a marginally effective soldier with minimal investment in training. The arquebus, appearing in the early 15th century, represented the first practical infantry firearm. The weapon consisted of a simple iron or bronze barrel, perhaps 3 feet long, mounted on a wooden stock. A matchlock mechanism allowed the soldier to aim and fire while keeping both hands on the weapon, a significant improvement over earlier hand cannons that required an assistant to apply a flame to the touch hole. The arquebus fired a lead ball weighing roughly 1 ounce, propelled by a charge of black powder ignited through a touch hole near the sealed breech end of the barrel. Loading an arquebus involved a carefully choreographed sequence. The soldier measured a charge of powder from a flask or pre-measured container and poured it down the muzzle. A cloth or paper patch followed, then the lead ball, and finally a ramrod pushed everything firmly against the breech. The soldier then primed the pan with a small amount of finer-grained powder, checked that the match was burning properly, and only then was the weapon ready to fire. The entire process consumed at least 30 seconds for a practiced user, and far longer for inexperienced troops under the stress of combat. Accuracy was marginal at best. The smooth-bore barrel imparted no spin to the projectile, which tumbled erratically in flight. The spherical ball, an aerodynamically poor shape, lost velocity rapidly to air resistance. Wind affected the light projectile significantly. The loose fit between ball and barrel, necessary to allow easy loading, meant that much of the propellant gas escaped around the projectile rather than accelerating it efficiently. Beyond 50 yards, hitting a specific individual became more a matter of fortune than skill. Military tacticians compensated for individual inaccuracy through massed fire. Ranks of arquebusiers stood shoulder to shoulder, presenting a wall of gun barrels toward the enemy. On command, entire ranks fired simultaneously, creating a lethal zone that compensated through volume of fire for what individual weapons lacked in precision. Rotating fire systems emerged, where front ranks would discharge their weapons, then retire to reload while subsequent ranks advanced to take their place, maintaining continuous fire against the enemy. The musket evolved from the arquebus as a larger, more powerful weapon. Where an arquebus might fire a ball weighing 1 ounce, muskets launched projectiles of 1.5 to 2 ounces, driven by proportionally larger powder charges. The increased power came at a cost. Early muskets were so heavy that they required a forked rest to support the barrel during aiming and firing. A soldier carried not just the weapon, but also the rest, powder flask, bullet pouch and other equipment, becoming heavily encumbered. Improvements in metallurgy gradually reduced musket weight while maintaining or increasing barrel strength. Stronger iron allowed thinner barrel walls that could still safely contain the high pressures generated during firing. By the 17th century, muskets had become light enough to fire from the shoulder without a rest, though they remained substantially heavier than modern firearms. These weapons typically measured 4 to 5 feet in length overall, with barrels accounting for 3 to 4 feet of that length. The development of the flintlock mechanism in the early 17th century marked a significant advancement in ignition reliability. Rather than maintaining a constantly burning slow match, which created logistical challenges and tactical vulnerabilities, the flintlock employed a piece of flint held in a spring-loaded cock. When the trigger released the cock, it snapped forward, striking a piece of hardened steel called a frizzen. The impact created sparks that fell into the priming pan, igniting the fine powder there, which in turn flashed through the touch hole to ignite the main charge. The mechanism was faster, more reliable, and safer than the matchlock, though considerably more expensive to manufacture. Ammunition evolved alongside firing mechanisms. Early guns used simple lead balls cast in moulds, with each soldier often casting his own ammunition. The balls were deliberately undersized relative to the barrel bore, allowing easy loading even when black powder residue fouled the barrel interior. This gap, called windage, reduced ballistic efficiency but was necessary given the technology available. Paper cartridges appeared by the late 16th century, containing a measured powder charge and ball wrapped together. A soldier bit open the cartridge, poured a small amount of powder into the priming pan, then dumped the rest down the barrel, followed by the ball and the paper itself as wadding. Rifled firearms existed during this period, but remained uncommon for military use. Cutting spiral grooves into the barrel interior imparted spin to the projectile, dramatically improving accuracy and effective range. However, the tight fit required for the bullet to engage the rifling made loading extremely difficult and slow. Rifles served primarily as specialized hunting weapons, or the arms of elite marksmen who could afford the time required for careful loading. Military forces prioritized rate of fire over precision, maintaining smooth-bore muskets as the standard infantry weapon. Artillery underwent parallel development, scaling up the principles of small arms to create weapons capable of battering fortifications and devastating troop formations. Early cannons were cast in bronze or forged from iron staves bound with hoops, similar to barrel construction. These weapons fired stone balls, or increasingly, iron shot, as foundries developed techniques for casting solid spheres. The relationship between bore diameter and projectile weight became standardized over time, with cannon designated by the weight of shot they fired. A 12-pounder fired a solid iron ball weighing 12 pounds. The science of ballistics began to emerge during this period as mathematicians and engineers attempted to understand and predict projectile trajectories. Niccolò Tartaglia published work in the mid-16th century analysing the paths of cannonballs, correctly identifying that trajectories were curved rather than the combination of straight lines that earlier theorists had proposed. Galileo's studies of motion and acceleration provided theoretical frameworks that later ballisticians would apply to practical gunnery problems. These early investigations represented the beginning of a formal scientific approach to projectile motion, transforming what had been purely empirical craft knowledge into principles that could be taught and calculated. By the late 17th century, firearms had achieved clear supremacy over bows and crossbows in military applications. Armies throughout Europe, Asia, and the Americas had reorganized around gunpowder weapons. The age of the archer was ending, relegated to history and nostalgia. Yet the projectiles of this era remained fundamentally simple: spherical lead or iron balls driven by the crude explosive force of black powder. The next centuries would bring revolutions in ammunition design, propellants, and delivery systems that would make 17th century muskets seem as primitive as stone-tipped arrows. The Industrial Revolution transformed projectile technology as profoundly as it altered every other aspect of human civilization. The transition from craft manufacture to industrial production, the application of scientific principles to engineering challenges, and the development of new materials and processes converged to create weapons of unprecedented accuracy, range, and lethality. The 19th century witnessed changes in firearms design that eclipsed all previous evolution in the history of projectile weapons. The critical breakthrough came not from a single invention, but from the confluence of several innovations that addressed long-standing limitations of muzzle-loading firearms. Chief among these was the mini ball, developed by French Army Captain Claude-Étienne Minié in the 1840s. This deceptively simple innovation solved a problem that had plagued firearms designers for centuries: how to combine the accuracy of rifling with the ease of loading required for military weapons. The mini ball was not spherical, but cylindro-conoidal, shaped like a modern bullet with a cylindrical body and pointed nose. Its base featured a hollow cavity, and the bullet was deliberately undersized relative to the rifle bore, allowing it to slide easily down the barrel during loading. The genius lay in what happened during firing. The explosion of propellant gases expanded the hollow base, forcing the soft lead to grip the rifling grooves. As the bullet travelled down the barrel, the rifling imparted spin, stabilising its flight through gyroscopic effect. Upon leaving the muzzle, the spinning bullet maintained its orientation, cutting through air with far less resistance than a tumbling spherical ball. The accuracy improvement was dramatic. Where smoothbore muskets struggled to hit man-sized targets beyond 50 yards, rifles firing mini-balls could strike individual soldiers at 300 yards or more. Effective range tripled or quadrupled, fundamentally altering infantry tactics. The increased range meant that attacking forces faced withering fire across distances that previously allowed relatively safe approach to enemy positions. The American Civil War demonstrated these effects with terrible clarity, as armies employing Napoleonic-era massed assault tactics met weapons whose accuracy made such formations suicidal. Simultaneously, percussion cap ignition replaced flintlock mechanisms. The percussion cap, a small copper cup containing a shock-sensitive explosive compound, fit over a hollow nipple connected to the barrel's powder charge. When the hammer struck the cap, it detonated, sending flame through the nipple to ignite the main charge. This system proved more reliable than flintlocks, functioned in wet weather, and eliminated the shower of sparks that made flintlocks dangerous around loose powder. The percussion cap represented the first application of modern chemistry to firearms ignition, employing fulminate of mercury as the primary explosive compound. The transition to breech-loading weapons marked another watershed moment. Rather than loading through the muzzle, breech loaders allowed insertion of ammunition at the rear of the barrel. This simple change enabled soldiers to reload while lying prone, taking cover behind obstacles, or even while mounted on horseback. Rate of fire increased substantially. A skilled soldier with a muzzle loader might fire 3 aimed shots per minute. That same soldier with a breech loader could fire 10 or more. Early breech-loading mechanisms faced significant challenges. Creating a gas-tight seal at the breech proved difficult with the metallurgy and manufacturing tolerances available in the mid-19th century. Escaping gases not only wasted propulsive energy, but also posed danger to the shooter. Various systems attempted to solve this problem. Some employed interrupted screw threads. Others used wedge blocks or dropping blocks. The Dries needle gun, adopted by Prussia in 1841, used a long firing pin that pierced a combustible paper cartridge to strike a percussion cap at the bullet's base, igniting the powder charge from front to back. The development of metallic cartridges in the mid-1800s unified projectile, propellant, and primer into a single package. A brass case held the powder charge, with the bullet crimped into one end and a primer inserted in the base. Brass possessed ideal properties for this application. It was ductile enough to expand under firing pressure, sealing the breech against gas escape, yet elastic enough to contract afterward, allowing easy extraction. The cartridge case also protected the powder from moisture and allowed reliable, rapid loading. Smokeless powder, invented in the 1880s, represented a quantum leap in propellant technology. Black powder, used for centuries, produced copious smoke that obscured vision and revealed shooter positions. It also left corrosive residues that fouled barrels and required constant cleaning. Smokeless powder, based on nitrocellulose, burned far more efficiently, producing 3 times the energy per unit mass while generating minimal smoke. The higher energy density allowed smaller cartridges to achieve equivalent or superior performance, and the cleaner combustion improved reliability and reduced maintenance. The ballistic advantages of smokeless powder extended beyond simple energy density. Its more progressive burning characteristics meant that pressure built more gradually, allowing stronger acceleration over a longer barrel length without exceeding safe pressure limits. Projectiles could achieve higher velocities, extending effective range and improving terminal performance. The reduced smoke transformed infantry tactics by allowing shooters to remain concealed and fire repeatedly without giving away their positions. Bullet design evolved to exploit the higher velocities that smokeless powder enabled. Full metal jacket bullets, with a lead core enclosed in a copper or steel shell, prevented barrel leading at high velocities and improved aerodynamics. The jacket also affected terminal ballistics, the bullet's behavior upon striking a target. International conventions eventually mandated full metal jacket ammunition for military use, prohibiting expanding bullets that caused more severe wounds. Artillery underwent parallel transformation during the Industrial Age. Rifled cannons replaced smooth-bore pieces, dramatically improving accuracy at long range. Breech-loading mechanisms allowed faster firing and enabled gun crews to work under cover. Recoil mechanisms, employing hydraulic cylinders, absorbed the violent backward motion of firing, allowing the gun to remain on target and eliminating the need to re-aim after each shot. These innovations combined to increase effective artillery range from a few thousand yards to several miles, with accuracy measured in dozens of yards rather than hundreds. Explosive shells supplanted solid shot as the primary artillery projectile. These hollow projectiles carried bursting charges that detonated on impact or after a time delay, showering the target area with metal fragments. Shrapnel shells, named after their inventor Henry Shrapnel, contained scores of small lead balls and a bursting charge timed to explode above enemy troops, raining bullets downward. High explosive shells employed powerful compounds like TNT or picric acid to create devastating blast effects. The science of ballistics matured into a rigorous discipline during this period. Researchers conducted systematic studies of air resistance, developing drag coefficients for various projectile shapes. They investigated the complex interaction between rifling twist rate, projectile length, and stability. Wind tunnels allowed testing of bullet designs under controlled conditions. Mathematical models predicted trajectories with increasing accuracy, allowing artillery to engage targets beyond visual range using calculated firing solutions. By the close of the 19th century, the modern firearm had emerged in recognizable form. Bolt-action rifles firing smokeless powder cartridges equipped infantry forces worldwide. Machine guns, capable of sustained rapid fire, appeared on battlefields. Artillery could strike targets miles distant with devastating accuracy. The projectiles themselves had evolved from simple spheres to carefully engineered shapes optimized for ballistic efficiency and terminal effect. The stage was set for the 20th century, an era that would see projectile technology applied on scales of industrial slaughter previously unimaginable, and would ultimately extend human reach from the trenches of Europe to the surface of the moon and beyond. The 20th century opened with projectile weapons that had reached a high state of development, yet the demands of 2 world wars would drive innovations that transform not just the weapons themselves, but the fundamental nature of how projectiles were employed. The scale of industrial warfare, the introduction of mechanized combat, and the emergence of aerial warfare created pressures that accelerated technological evolution at an unprecedented pace. The First World War demonstrated both the terrible effectiveness of late 19th century weapons and their limitations when applied to modern industrial conflict. Machine guns, perfected in the decades before the war, could fire hundreds of rounds per minute with devastating accuracy. The Maxim gun, invented by Hiram Maxim in 1884, employed the recoil energy from each shot to extract the spent cartridge, load a fresh round and cock the firing mechanism. This automatic cycle of operation transformed a single soldier into a position capable of delivering fire equivalent to dozens of riflemen. Artillery dominated the battlefields of the Great War in ways that infantry weapons could not. Guns firing shells weighing hundreds of pounds could strike targets miles behind enemy lines, destroying supply depots, command posts, and troop concentrations with relative impunity. The development of indirect fire techniques, where artillery engaged targets beyond the gunner's line of sight using calculated firing data, turned artillery into a science requiring precise mathematics and sophisticated observation networks. Shells grew more sophisticated in their effects. High explosive rounds containing TNT or ammonium nitrate compounds created blast waves that could collapse trenches and bunkers. Shrapnel shells dispersed thousands of steel balls over wide areas, devastating troops in the open. Gas shells delivered chemical agents including chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas, weaponizing chemistry in ways that horrified even veterans accustomed to conventional slaughter. The variety of ammunition types reflected the diverse tactical challenges of trench warfare, each designed to address specific defensive configurations or tactical situations. Tank armor introduced a new challenge for projectile weapons. Conventional bullets and shell fragments bounced harmlessly off steel plate. Anti-tank weapons emerged in response, initially as specialized rifles firing armor-piercing ammunition. These projectiles employed hardened steel cores that concentrated kinetic energy on a small area, punching through armor plate. As tank armor grew thicker, anti-tank guns scaled upward, firing larger projectiles at higher velocities to maintain penetrating capability. The interwar period saw refinement of existing technologies and the emergence of new theoretical frameworks for understanding projectile behavior. Aerodynamicists developed more sophisticated models of air resistance, leading to bullet designs with improved ballistic coefficients. The boat-tail bullet, featuring a tapered base, reduced drag by minimizing turbulence in the projectile's wake. Pointed Spitzer bullets replaced round-nosed designs, cutting through air more efficiently and extending effective range. The Second World War accelerated innovation across every domain of projectile technology. The conflict's global scale and mechanized nature demanded weapons effective against a bewildering variety of targets. Aircraft, tanks, fortifications, ships, submarines, and infantry. Specialized ammunition proliferated, each type optimized for specific purposes. Armor-piercing ammunition evolved rapidly to counter increasingly thick tank armor. Simple hardened steel cores gave way to tungsten carbide, a material significantly harder and denser than steel. Later, depleted uranium, denser still, became the material of choice for penetrators. These projectiles relied on kinetic energy, striking armor at velocities exceeding 3,000 feet per second and punching through by sheer force. The long rod penetrator, a dart-like projectile stabilized by fins rather than spin, concentrated tremendous energy on a tiny impact area, achieving penetration that earlier generations would have considered impossible. Shaped charge technology introduced an entirely different approach to defeating armor. Rather than relying on kinetic energy, shaped charges employed the Monroe effect, where a carefully configured explosive charge with a conical metal liner created a high-velocity jet of metallic particles upon detonation. This jet could penetrate armor many times the charge's diameter, making it possible for relatively small weapons to defeat heavy armor. The bazooka, Panzerfaust, and similar weapons gave infantry anti-tank capability previously requiring dedicated artillery. Aircraft introduced three-dimensional warfare, and with it the challenge of hitting fast-moving targets in the sky. Anti-aircraft ammunition included both conventional explosive shells with timed or proximity fuses and specialized rounds designed to maximize the chance of damaging aircraft. Proximity fuses, developed during the war, employed miniature radar systems that detected when the shell passed near a target and detonated automatically, far more effective than timed fuses that relied on precise distance estimation. Incendiary ammunition combined pyrophoric materials, like white phosphorus, with projectile delivery, creating weapons that ignited fuel tanks, set fire to structures, or marked targets with smoke. Tracer rounds incorporated compounds that burned brightly during flight, allowing shooters to observe bullet trajectories and adjust aim. These glowing projectiles served multiple purposes: aiming reference, signaling, and psychological effect, as streams of tracers could demoralize enemy troops even if they inflicted minimal casualties. The development of the assault rifle represented a philosophical shift in infantry weapons design. Traditional military rifles fired powerful cartridges effective at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Yet combat statistics revealed that most engagements occurred at far shorter distances. The intermediate cartridge, less powerful than full-size rifle rounds but more potent than pistol ammunition, offered an optimal balance. Lighter ammunition allowed soldiers to carry more rounds. Reduced recoil enabled controllable automatic fire. The STG-44, developed by Germany late in the war, established the template that would dominate infantry weapons for decades to come. Naval warfare drove projectile development in unique directions. Battleship guns firing shells weighing over a ton could strike targets 20 miles distant. These enormous projectiles required sophisticated fire control systems, integrating rangefinders, mechanical computers, and gyroscopic stabilization to achieve hits on moving targets at extreme range. Armor-piercing naval shells employed hardened caps and carefully designed ogives to penetrate the massive armor plate protecting capital ships. The atomic bomb, while not a projectile in the traditional sense, represented the ultimate expression of delivered destructive power. Its development required solving numerous ballistics challenges, including designing a bomb casing that would survive high-altitude release and fall predictably to the aiming point. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki demonstrated that a single projectile, properly designed and delivered, could destroy an entire city, a capability that would reshape global politics and military strategy for the remainder of the century. By 1945, projectile technology had reached extraordinary levels of sophistication. Weapons existed to defeat virtually any target, delivered by means ranging from individual soldiers to strategic bombers. The fundamental physics governing projectile motion had been thoroughly explored and reduced to engineering practice. Metallurgy, chemistry, and manufacturing capability had advanced to the point where designs limited previously by material constraints could now be realized. Yet even as conventional projectile technology matured, new domains were opening. The jet age was beginning, and with it would come projectiles that flew faster than sound, guided themselves to targets, and ultimately left Earth's atmosphere entirely, entering the realm of space where the very concept of a projectile would take on meanings undreamed of by earlier generations. The Cold War era witnessed a transformation in projectile technology that extended far beyond incremental improvements in existing weapons. The geopolitical tension between nuclear-armed superpowers drove research into systems that could deliver warheads across continents, intercept incoming missiles, and strike targets with precision previously unattainable. Simultaneously, regional conflicts throughout Asia, Africa, and the Middle East spurred development of conventional weapons that balanced effectiveness with cost and reliability. This dual pressure created an environment where innovation proceeded along multiple parallel tracks. The guided missile represented perhaps the most significant departure from traditional projectile concepts. Where conventional projectiles followed ballistic trajectories determined entirely by launch conditions, guided missiles could alter their flight path in response to sensor input or external commands. The German V-2 rocket, developed during the Second World War, demonstrated the potential for long-range ballistic missiles, though it lacked terminal guidance and relied on inertial navigation alone. Post-war development refined these concepts into weapons of extraordinary capability. Intercontinental ballistic missiles emerged as the ultimate expression of projectile range and destructive power. These weapons followed suborbital trajectories, climbing to altitudes exceeding 600 miles before descending toward targets thousands of miles distant. The physics governing their flight involved orbital mechanics rather than simple ballistics. During the boost phase, powerful rocket engines accelerated the missile to velocities approaching 15,000 miles per hour. The mid-course phase saw the warhead coasting through space in a ballistic arc, subject only to gravitational forces. The terminal phase brought re-entry into the atmosphere at hypersonic velocities, where aerodynamic heating raised surface temperatures to thousands of degrees. Re-entry vehicle design became a specialized field, addressing challenges unlike any encountered in conventional projectiles. The blunt body shape, counterintuitive for a projectile, proved optimal for managing re-entry heating. A shockwave formed ahead of the blunt nose, keeping the superheated plasma at a distance from the vehicle surface. Ablative heat shields gradually vaporized, carrying away thermal energy and protecting the warhead within. The entire system had to function autonomously, as no communication with the missile was possible during the plasma-shrouded re-entry phase. Multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles multiplied the effectiveness of strategic missiles. A single booster could carry a dozen or more warheads, each capable of striking a different target. During the mid-course phase, a post-boost vehicle maneuvered using small thrusters, releasing warheads sequentially along trajectories calculated to impact widely separated targets. This capability complicated defensive systems enormously, as a single incoming missile could threaten numerous cities or military installations. Cruise missiles took a different approach, flying through the atmosphere at subsonic or supersonic speeds along relatively low-altitude flight paths. Terrain following radar allowed these weapons to hug the ground, exploiting terrain masking to avoid detection by defensive radars. Inertial navigation systems, later supplemented by GPS, provided guidance accurate to within meters over ranges of thousands of miles. The combination of low observability, precision guidance, and conventional or nuclear payloads made cruise missiles extraordinarily versatile weapons. Anti-ballistic missile systems attempted to solve the immensely difficult problem of intercepting incoming warheads. The challenge involved detecting launches, calculating trajectories, and placing interceptor missiles on collision courses with targets moving at many times the speed of sound. Early systems like Nike Zeus employed nuclear-tipped interceptors, accepting that precise hit-to-kill intercepts were too difficult and relying instead on nuclear blast effects to disable incoming warheads. Later systems like Sprint achieved phenomenal accelerations, reaching hypersonic velocities within seconds of launch to intercept warheads during their terminal phase. Precision-guided munitions revolutionized conventional warfare by allowing individual projectiles to strike specific targets with extraordinary accuracy. Laser-guided bombs, introduced during the Vietnam War, used reflected laser energy to guide themselves to designated aim points. A laser designator illuminated the target, and a seeker in the bomb's nose detected the reflected energy, steering toward it via movable fins. This transformed unguided bombs from area weapons requiring dozens or hundreds of drops to achieve target destruction into precision instruments that could strike specific buildings or even specific rooms within buildings. Television-guided weapons took precision further, allowing operators to view the target through a camera in the projectile's nose and manually steer it to impact. The AGM-62 Walleye, deployed in the late 1960s, pioneered this approach. More advanced systems incorporated automatic target tracking, where image recognition algorithms locked onto targets and maintained aim even as the projectile maneuvered during terminal flight. The development of GPS in the 1970s and 80s enabled an entirely new class of precision weapons. GPS-guided munitions received position data from satellite constellations, comparing their actual location against planned flight paths and adjusting trajectory accordingly. These weapons operated in any weather, day or night, without requiring external targeting systems beyond the initial target coordinates. Accuracy improved to the point where a bomb dropped from 30,000 feet could reliably strike within 30 feet of its aim point, a level of precision that would have seemed fantastical to bombardiers of earlier eras. Anti-aircraft missiles evolved from primitive command-guided systems to sophisticated fire-and-forget weapons. Early missiles like the Nike Ajax required continuous radar tracking of both target and missile, with ground-based computers calculating intercept courses and transmitting steering commands. Later systems employed semi-active radar homing, where the missile followed radar energy reflected from the target. Active radar homing missiles carried their own radar transmitters, making them completely autonomous after launch. Infrared-seeking missiles detected the heat signatures of jet engines, guiding themselves toward targets without any radar emissions that might trigger warning systems. Surface-to-air missiles created a new dynamic in aerial warfare, forcing aircraft to fly at low altitudes to avoid radar detection or develop electronic countermeasures to defeat missile guidance systems. This in turn drove the development of low-altitude air defense missiles designed to engage targets flying barely above the ground. Man-portable air defense systems like the Stinger gave infantry the ability to engage aircraft, introducing threats that expensive combat jets had to respect even from seemingly insignificant ground forces. Air-to-air missiles transformed aerial combat from gunfight-like engagements at close range to beyond visual range intercepts, where pilots might never see their targets. The AIM-9 Sidewinder, a heat-seeking missile, could track and destroy aircraft from miles away. Later, radar-guided missiles like the AIM-7 Sparrow and AIM-120 AMRAAM extended engagement ranges to dozens of miles, allowing fighter aircraft to shoot down opponents who had no indication they were even being targeted until the missile's active radar illuminated them seconds before impact. Anti-tank guided missiles addressed the continuing competition between armour and anti-armour weapons. Wire-guided systems like the TOW missile allowed operators to steer projectiles onto targets thousands of meters distant, the missile trailing a thin wire through which guidance commands passed. Later generations employed laser beam riding or fire-and-forget seekers, freeing operators to take cover immediately after launch. Top attack profiles exploited the fact that tank armour was typically thinnest on the upper surfaces, with missiles climbing above the target before diving downward onto vulnerable roof areas. The miniaturization of electronics enabled increasingly sophisticated guidance systems in progressively smaller packages. Missiles that once required truck-mounted launchers shrank to shoulder-fired weapons. Computing power that filled rooms in the 1960s fit into chipsets weighing ounces by the 1990s. This trend towards smaller, smarter weapons continued throughout the Cold War, driven by the dual requirements of tactical effectiveness and the economic pressures of producing weapons in sufficient quantities to deter potential adversaries. By the end of the 20th century, projectiles had evolved from simple ballistic objects into intelligent systems capable of autonomous decision-making. They could navigate complex routes to targets, distinguish between legitimate targets and decoys, coordinate attacks with other weapons, and adapt to changing battlefield conditions. The projectile had become a flying computer, its physical form almost secondary to the software and sensors that determined its effectiveness. This trajectory toward ever greater autonomy and precision would only accelerate in the 21st century, raising questions about the nature of warfare itself as humans ceded increasing control to the weapons they created. The transition into the 21st century brought projectile technology to levels of sophistication that would have appeared miraculous to weapons designers of previous generations. The integration of advanced materials, computational power, and sensor technology created weapons that blurred the line between projectile and autonomous system. Simultaneously, the nature of conflict evolved, with asymmetric warfare and counterinsurgency operations demanding different capabilities than the large-scale conventional battles that dominated Cold War planning. Precision-guided munitions achieved accuracy measured in inches rather than feet. The Joint Direct Attack Munition, or JDAM, converted unguided bombs into GPS-guided weapons through the addition of a bolt-on guidance kit. These kits cost a fraction of purpose-built guided weapons while delivering comparable accuracy. A JDAM could strike within 10 feet of its program coordinates regardless of weather conditions, altitude or aircraft speed. This democratization of precision meant that virtually any aircraft could deliver pinpoint strikes, not just specialized platforms equipped with expensive targeting systems. Small diameter bombs exemplified the trend toward lighter, more precise weapons. Where previous generations might drop a 2,000-pound bomb to destroy a single target, a 250-pound small diameter bomb could achieve the same effect with dramatically reduced collateral damage. The smaller warhead required greater accuracy to ensure effectiveness, driving guidance systems to unprecedented precision. The reduced weight also allowed aircraft to carry more weapons per sortie, increasing mission flexibility. Loitering munitions emerged as a hybrid between missile and unmanned aircraft. These weapons could orbit a target area for extended periods, searching for targets of opportunity before diving to attack when commanded or when onboard sensors detected valid targets. The distinction between a guided missile that could loiter and an unmanned aircraft that carried explosives became increasingly semantic. Systems like the IAI Harop could remain airborne for hours, searching autonomously for radar emissions and attacking any enemy air defense systems that activated. Hypersonic weapons represented the cutting edge of projectile velocity. Traditional cruise missiles flew at subsonic or low supersonic speeds, giving defensive systems time to detect and intercept them. Hypersonic glide vehicles, launched atop ballistic missiles, separated during the ascent phase and glided through the upper atmosphere at speeds exceeding Mach 5. Their unpredictable flight paths, combined with extreme velocity, made interception extraordinarily difficult with existing defensive systems. The weapons skipped along the boundary between atmosphere and space, using aerodynamic lift to extend range while maintaining speeds that left minimal reaction time for defenders. The physics of hypersonic flight presented formidable challenges. At velocities exceeding 5 times the speed of sound, air friction heated vehicle surfaces to temperatures that would melt conventional materials. Thermal protection systems similar to those protecting spacecraft during re-entry became necessary. Control surfaces had to function in the superheated plasma that surrounded the vehicle. Communication through the ionized sheath proved difficult, limiting the ability to update guidance commands during flight. Despite these obstacles, multiple nations invested heavily in hypersonic technology, recognizing its potential to overcome increasingly sophisticated missile defenses. Electromagnetic railguns employed an entirely different propulsion principle, using electromagnetic forces rather than chemical explosives to accelerate projectiles. 2 parallel rails carried enormous electrical currents, creating a powerful magnetic field. A conductive projectile placed between the rails completed the circuit. The magnetic field induced a force that accelerated the projectile along the rails at tremendous velocities. Naval railgun prototypes achieved muzzle velocities exceeding Mach 7, launching projectiles that could strike targets over 100 miles distant. The advantages of railguns extended beyond simple range. Projectiles travelled at such high velocities that they required no explosive warhead, relying entirely on kinetic energy to destroy targets. This eliminated the need to store dangerous explosives aboard ships. The projectiles, simple metal slugs, cost far less than guided missiles while achieving comparable or superior range. However, the technology faced significant challenges. The enormous electrical currents required massive power systems. Rail erosion from repeated firings limited barrel life. Guidance of purely kinetic projectiles at extreme ranges proved difficult without adding expensive terminal guidance systems. Directed energy weapons, while not projectiles in the traditional sense, represented an evolution in the fundamental concept of attacking targets at a distance. High-energy lasers achieved tactical deployment, capable of destroying unmanned aircraft, small boats, and incoming mortars or rockets. These systems delivered energy at the speed of light, eliminating the need to calculate ballistic trajectories or lead moving targets. The beam simply had to remain focused on the target long enough to deposit sufficient thermal energy to cause structural failure or detonate explosive components. Counter-drone systems emerged as a new category of defensive weapons, addressing the proliferation of small unmanned aircraft in military and civilian contexts. Traditional air defense systems designed to engage fast-moving aircraft or missiles proved ineffective and economically absurd when applied to small, slow drones. Purpose-built solutions included shotgun-like projectile weapons that created clouds of shot to physically intercept drones, net-launching systems that entangled rotors, and directed radio frequency weapons that disrupted drone control links or damaged electronics. Artificial intelligence began influencing projectile guidance and targeting in increasingly significant ways. Machine learning algorithms could distinguish between different vehicle types, identifying tanks versus armored personnel carriers versus civilian trucks with reliability exceeding human operators. Autonomous target recognition systems analyzed infrared or visible light imagery in real time, selecting aim points on detected targets to maximize weapon effectiveness. Swarms of cooperative munitions could communicate among themselves, coordinating attacks to overwhelm defenses or ensure redundant coverage of critical targets. The ethical implications of autonomous weapons sparked intense debate within military and civilian circles. Weapons capable of selecting and engaging targets without human intervention raised questions about accountability, the laws of armed conflict, and the fundamental nature of human control over the use of force. Some systems operated with humans on the loop, rather than in the loop, monitoring autonomous operations and retaining the ability to override decisions but not making real-time targeting choices. The trend toward autonomy appeared irreversible, driven by the speed of modern warfare and the advantages that autonomous systems held in reaction time and immunity to certain countermeasures. Material science contributed projectile advances through development of new compounds and manufacturing techniques. Three-dimensional printing allowed production of projectile components with internal geometries impossible to create through traditional machining. Tungsten alloys and depleted uranium remained the materials of choice for armor-piercing penetrators, but advances in processing techniques improved their performance. Composite materials reduced weight while maintaining strength, allowing larger weapons to be carried by smaller platforms. Rocket-assisted projectiles extended the range of conventional artillery to distances previously achievable only by missiles. These hybrid munitions used conventional gun propulsion for initial acceleration, then ignited small rocket motors during flight to maintain velocity and extend range. Base-bleed projectiles employed a different approach, burning pyrotechnic charges to fill the low-pressure area behind the projectile with gas, reducing base drag and increasing range by 20 to 30% without the complexity of rocket motors. Sensor-fused weapons addressed area targets by dispensing submunitions that could independently detect and attack individual targets within a footprint. An artillery shell or bomb would release dozens of submunitions over a target area. Each submunition descended on a parachute, spinning to scan the ground below with infrared or millimeter wave sensors. Upon detecting a target matching its recognition algorithms, the submunition fired an explosively formed penetrator downward, capable of defeating armoured vehicles. This effectively transformed a single projectile into dozens of semi-autonomous weapons, each capable of engaging separate targets. The proliferation of advanced projectile technology to non-state actors and smaller nations created new security challenges. Precision-guided weapons, once available only to major military powers, could be purchased commercially or manufactured using widely available components. GPS receivers, inertial measurement units, and microprocessors powerful enough to run guidance algorithms were consumer products, raising concerns about improvised guided weapons constructed from commercial parts. By the second decade of the 21st century, projectile technology had reached a point where the limiting factors were less often technical capability and more often policy constraints, economic considerations, or ethical concerns. Weapons existed or could be developed to strike virtually any target with precision approaching perfection. The challenge had shifted from making weapons accurate enough to making choices about when and whether such precision should be employed, and increasingly, who or what should make those decisions. The realm beyond Earth's atmosphere represents both the ultimate expression of projectile technology and a fundamental transformation of what it means to launch an object toward a target. Spaceflight demands escape from Earth's gravitational well, a feat requiring velocities exceeding 25,000 miles per hour. At such speeds, the projectile becomes a spacecraft, and the physics governing its motion shift from atmospheric ballistics to orbital mechanics. Yet the fundamental concept remains: accelerating an object and directing it toward a destination, whether that destination lies across a battlefield or across the solar system. The V2 rocket, despite its role as a weapon, established principles that would enable space exploration. Its designers understood that reaching extreme altitudes required multi-stage thinking, where successive rocket sections ignited and then separated, shedding mass to allow remaining stages to achieve higher velocities. This concept of staging became fundamental to all subsequent launch vehicles. The Saturn V rocket that carried astronauts to the moon employed 3 stages, each optimized for operation at different altitudes and velocities, collectively achieving the energy required to break free from Earth's gravity. Orbital mechanics introduced concepts foreign to terrestrial projectile science. An object in orbit is perpetually falling toward Earth, while simultaneously moving sideways fast enough that it continuously misses the planet. This counterintuitive reality means that speeding up in orbit actually causes a spacecraft to slow down in its subsequent trajectory, while slowing down makes it speed up later. The Hohmann transfer orbit, the most fuel-efficient path between 2 circular orbits, requires precise calculation of velocity changes at specific points. These principles govern everything from satellite deployment to interplanetary missions. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, while weapons rather than spacecraft, follow suborbital trajectories that share characteristics with space launches. The boost phase accelerates the warhead to velocities approaching orbital speed, though not quite fast enough to achieve stable orbit. The mid-course phase sees the warhead coasting through the vacuum of space in a ballistic arc. Modern ICBMs achieve such precision that warheads can strike within a few hundred feet of targets thousands of miles distant, a feat requiring extraordinary accuracy in both the initial velocity imparted and the direction of that velocity vector. Space-based weapons concepts explored during the Cold War included kinetic bombardment systems, sometimes called rods from God. These theoretical weapons would position tungsten rods in orbit, then deorbit them above targets. The rods would accelerate during re-entry, striking with kinetic energy equivalent to tactical nuclear weapons, but without radioactive fallout, while never deployed, Such systems represented thinking about how the ultimate high ground of orbital space might be weaponized, turning projectiles into planet-striking meteors. Anti-satellite weapons developed along multiple paths, each addressing the challenge of destroying or disabling objects traveling at orbital velocities. Direct ascent missiles launched from the ground could intercept satellites in low Earth orbit, though the physics of catching up to an object moving at 17,000 miles per hour presented formidable challenges. Co-orbital weapons launched into orbits that matched target satellites, then maneuvered close enough to damage or destroy them through various means. The difficulty of these intercepts made every successful test a demonstration of extraordinary technical capability. Space debris created by anti-satellite tests or satellite collisions posed long-term hazards to orbital operations. A destroyed satellite might fragment into thousands of pieces, each becoming a high-velocity projectile capable of damaging other satellites. At orbital velocities, even paint flecks carried enough kinetic energy to damage spacecraft. The Kessler syndrome, a theoretical cascade where each collision created debris that caused additional collisions, represented a nightmare scenario where certain orbital altitudes might become unusable for generations. Interplanetary probes extended the concept of projectiles across distances that dwarf anything possible within Earth's atmosphere. These spacecraft employed gravity assists, using the gravitational fields of planets to alter trajectories and gain velocity without expending fuel. The Voyager probes, launched in 1977, used this technique to visit Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune before continuing into interstellar space. Their trajectories required calculating launch windows that occurred once every 176 years, when planetary alignments allowed the specific sequence of gravity assists needed. Precision in interplanetary navigation reached astonishing levels. The Mars Science Laboratory, carrying the Curiosity rover, travelled 350 million miles over 8 months and landed within 1.5 miles of its target point in Gale Crater. This accuracy required accounting for countless factors: the gravitational influence of the Sun, Moon and planets, solar radiation pressure pushing on the spacecraft, and even the recoil from venting excess heat. Course corrections during the journey refined the trajectory, burning small amounts of fuel at precise moments to adjust the final landing location. Atmospheric entry from interplanetary velocities presented challenges exceeding those of ICBM re-entry vehicles. The Mars Science Laboratory entered the Martian atmosphere at 13,000 miles per hour, well into the hypersonic regime. A heat shield protected the spacecraft during initial deceleration, experiencing temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The thin Martian atmosphere, less than 1% the density of Earth's, made parachute deceleration alone insufficient. A rocket-powered sky crane lowered the rover on cables for the final meters, a sequence of maneuvers that had to execute autonomously due to the communication delay between Mars and Earth. Sample return missions represented the ultimate in projectile precision, launching material from another celestial body and delivering it to a specific point on Earth. The Apollo missions demonstrated this capability by returning lunar samples. More recent missions, like Japan's Hayabusa probes, collected material from asteroids and returned it to Earth, with re-entry capsules landing in predetermined recovery zones. These missions required solving the ballistic problem in reverse, launching from a body with different gravity and no atmosphere, navigating through interplanetary space, and precisely targeting Earth's atmosphere for capture. Ion propulsion systems offered an alternative to chemical rockets for deep space missions, using electric fields to accelerate ions to extremely high velocities. While the thrust produced was minimal, continuous operation over months or years could achieve velocity changes impossible with chemical propulsion. The Dawn spacecraft used ion engines to orbit two different asteroids, Vesta and Ceres, a feat unachievable with conventional rockets. This technology represented a philosophical shift from impulsive high-thrust maneuvers to gentle but persistent acceleration. Nuclear propulsion concepts explored methods of achieving velocities that would make interplanetary travel practical for human missions. Nuclear thermal rockets would heat propellant using a nuclear reactor, achieving exhaust velocities double those of chemical rockets. More exotic concepts like nuclear pulse propulsion proposed detonating nuclear explosives behind a spacecraft, using the blast to accelerate it. Project Orion, studied in the 1950s and 60s, calculated that such a vehicle could reach significant fractions of light speed, making interstellar missions conceivable, if not practical. The projectiles humanity launched into space carried more than scientific instruments or weapons. They represented our species reaching beyond its planetary cradle, extending agency across distances and timescales that would have been incomprehensible to the first humans who threw stones at prey. A radio signal from Voyager 1, now beyond the heliopause in interstellar space, takes over 22 hours to reach Earth. Yet that spacecraft, launched when Jimmy Carter was president, continues executing commands. A projectile whose mission will outlast everyone involved in its creation. In this sense, space exploration represents the ultimate expression of the projectile concept, launching something toward a distant destination and trusting that the physics governing its motion will carry it true. The trajectory of projectile development points toward futures both near and distant, where the boundaries between weapon, tool, and autonomous system continue to blur. Current research and emerging technologies suggest directions that projectile science may take in coming decades, extrapolations grounded in existing capabilities and the relentless pressure of technological advancement. Understanding these potential futures requires examining the convergence of multiple disciplines: artificial intelligence, materials science, energy storage, and manufacturing techniques that are transforming what becomes possible. Directed energy weapons are transitioning from experimental systems to operational deployment. High-energy lasers already protect military installations and naval vessels from incoming threats, but current systems represent merely the first generation of this technology. Future iterations will likely achieve higher power levels, allowing engagement of more challenging targets at greater ranges. Solid-state laser arrays could eventually replace some conventional projectile weapons entirely, offering unlimited ammunition constrained only by power generation, instant engagement of targets at light speed, and precision that eliminates collateral damage concerns. The physics governing laser weapons differ fundamentally from kinetic projectiles. Rather than delivering energy through mass and velocity, lasers deposit thermal energy directly onto target surfaces. Defeating laser weapons requires different defensive approaches than those effective against conventional projectiles. Highly reflective surfaces can deflect laser energy, though maintaining reflectivity under combat conditions presents challenges. Ablative coatings that vaporize when struck by laser beams can protect underlying structures, at least until the coating is consumed. The arms race between laser weapons and laser-resistant defenses has already begun. Particle beam weapons represent another directed energy approach, accelerating streams of atomic or subatomic particles to relativistic velocities and directing them at targets. Unlike lasers, particle beams are unaffected by atmospheric conditions that can scatter or absorb light. However, charged particle beams disperse due to mutual electrostatic repulsion between particles, limiting their effective range in atmosphere. Neutral particle beams avoid this problem but face other technical challenges. Space-based particle beam weapons remain a theoretical possibility, free from atmospheric limitations, though international treaties currently prohibit weaponization of space. Artificial intelligence will likely dominate future projectile development, not merely as guidance systems, but as autonomous decision makers. Swarms of hundreds or thousands of small munitions could coordinate attacks, sharing sensor data and dynamically allocating targets among themselves to maximize effectiveness. Such swarms could adapt to changing battlefield conditions faster than human commanders could issue orders, adjusting tactics in real time based on defensive responses. The technical capability to create fully autonomous lethal weapons already exists. The question is not whether such systems can be built, but whether they should be deployed and under what constraints. Miniaturization continues pushing towards smaller, more capable projectiles. Micro-munitions weighing mere ounces could be carried by drones or launched from handheld systems, each equipped with guidance systems and warheads sufficient to neutralize individual targets. A soldier might carry hundreds of such weapons, transforming individual infantry into distributed weapons platforms. The reduction in size would not eliminate lethality, but rather multiply the number of independent projectiles that could be deployed simultaneously, overwhelming defenses through sheer quantity rather than individual power. Metamaterials with engineered electromagnetic properties could render projectiles effectively invisible to radar and other sensors. Current stealth technology reduces radar cross-sections through shaping and absorptive coatings. Metamaterials could achieve similar or superior effects through their fundamental structure, bending electromagnetic waves around objects or absorbing them with near-perfect efficiency. A projectile wrapped in metamaterial cloaking could potentially defeat sensor-based defenses by remaining undetectable until impact. Additive manufacturing, commonly known as three-dimensional printing, may revolutionize projectile production and deployment. Future combat units might fabricate munitions on demand using portable printing systems, eliminating supply chain vulnerabilities and allowing rapid customization for specific tactical situations. Printing weapons at the point of use would reduce logistical burdens and enable designs optimized for immediate needs rather than general-purpose weapons manufactured months or years in advance. The technology already exists in primitive form. Its maturation could fundamentally alter how militaries equip and sustain forces. Quantum sensing technologies promise navigation and guidance systems immune to jamming or spoofing. Current GPS-dependent weapons can be degraded by denying access to satellite signals. Quantum inertial sensors that detect minute accelerations through quantum interference effects could provide navigation accurate enough for precision guidance without any external references. Such systems would make projectiles functionally unjammable, able to strike targets even in environments where all electromagnetic communications were disrupted. Hypersonic weapons will likely proliferate as the underlying technologies mature and spread to additional nations. The combination of speed, maneuverability, and altitude makes these weapons extraordinarily difficult to intercept with current defensive systems. Future hypersonic projectiles might incorporate artificial intelligence for terminal guidance, adaptive trajectory planning to defeat emerging threats, and exotic materials to withstand the thermal and mechanical stresses of hypersonic flight. The strategic implications of widely available hypersonic weapons include reduced warning times and increased vulnerability of fixed targets previously considered secure. Space-based weapons platforms remain largely theoretical and treaty-constrained, but technological trends suggest their eventual feasibility. Reusable launch systems are reducing the cost of placing payloads in orbit. Autonomous systems can operate for extended periods without human intervention. Power generation and storage technologies continue improving. The combination could enable orbital weapon systems capable of striking terrestrial targets within minutes of tasking, projecting power globally from the ultimate high ground. Whether such systems will be deployed depends on political decisions as much as technical capability. Electromagnetic propulsion technologies beyond current railguns may emerge. Coil gun systems, which use sequential electromagnetic coils to accelerate ferromagnetic projectiles, offer potential advantages over railguns, including reduced barrel wear and the ability to fine-tune acceleration profiles. More speculative concepts include mass drivers that could launch payloads from the lunar surface into space, effectively turning the moon into a base for launching projectiles anywhere in the solar system. Such systems remain science fiction for now, but the physics supporting them is sound. Biological and chemical sensors integrated into projectiles could enable weapons that discriminate between combatants and non-combatants, or that identify and neutralize specific chemical or biological threats. A projectile might analyze the atmosphere during flight, detecting hazardous compounds and navigating toward their source. Alternatively, munitions could release tailored countermeasures designed to neutralize detected threats, transforming offensive weapons into defensive systems that seek out and eliminate dangers autonomously. The fundamental limits of projectile performance imposed by physics remain unchanged. The speed of light represents an absolute ceiling for directed energy weapons. Conservation of momentum constrains kinetic weapons. Material strength limits the velocities that physical projectiles can achieve through conventional acceleration. Yet within these absolute limits, vast room for advancement persists. Current technologies operate far from theoretical maximums, suggesting that substantial improvements remain possible even without revolutionary breakthroughs. The ethical and strategic questions surrounding autonomous weapons, proportionality in the use of force, and the proliferation of advanced projectile technology to state and non-state actors will shape future development as significantly as technical considerations. International law, arms control agreements, and domestic policy decisions will determine which technically feasible weapons actually see deployment. The history of projectile development demonstrates that technological capability alone does not determine outcomes. Human choices about how to employ technology, which innovations to pursue and which to constrain, have always influenced the path that weapon development follows. From the first stone thrown by a prehistoric human to hypothetical railguns launching payloads toward distant planets, the story of projectiles traces an arc of increasing reach, precision, and power. Each generation extended the distance across which humans could project force, refined the accuracy with which targets could be struck, and multiplied the energy delivered on impact. This progression shows no sign of ending. The projectiles of the future will extend humanity's reach farther still, operating with intelligence that rivals or exceeds human decision-making, moving at velocities approaching theoretical limits, and striking with precision that eliminates the very concept of missing. What began with a thrown rock has become a technology that spans worlds and may yet reach the stars.